So, is the strings of bank failures that are going on right now part of a larger agenda? Maybe this isn't by accident. Let's talk about it. Now, of course, there are two arguments you can use to describe the current banking crisis that's going on with all these banks that are failing. On the one hand, you could say you could just chalk it up to incompetence, which is absolutely a possibility. But there's another possibility. Maybe this is part of a grand master plan to change the face of our banking system.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Now, in the United States, 30 years ago, we had 10,894 banks. As of today, we have just a little over 4,000 banks. So quite a big haircut over the last 30 years. So the banking system is starting to become centralized, which is not what you want. You want the banking system to be decentralized. And there's value in having a lot of different banks to choose from, especially in the world of real estate loans and personal loans. You know, every region has their own different characteristics, their own little differences that make a lot of difference in making decisions about issuing loans. Allow me to read a quote to you from Henry Kissinger. If you control the food, you control a nation. If you control the energy, you control a region. If you control the money, you control the world. I believe that's what is ultimately behind what's going on in the markets. Now, when you have a large decentralized financial system, it's hard for the Federal Reserve, for the central bank, to control it, right? Because you have a lot more banks that are doing their own thing. So the idea is to whittle that down to a small number of banks, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take a case in point. Let's look at JP Morgan. Okay, so let's just all agree that JP Morgan is the big dog in the financial industry. It's the guy, it's the man, right? Now, there was a law passed in 1994 that said no one bank can control more than 10% of the financial market. Now, JP Morgan, prior to last week, was already at their 10% limit. Now, the reason why they set that limit, of course, was to avoid monopolies, right? To avoid any one bank being too powerful. But in the recent acquisition by JP Morgan of First Republic, they took over an additional $100 billion worth of assets. Well, by law, they shouldn't be allowed to do any more expansion. But apparently, when the laws don't fit the agenda of the powers to be, they can apparently ignore laws. So JP Morgan just got even bigger. So let's look at a couple of charts that illustrates the financial health of the small banks versus the large banks. Okay, so this is from the Federal Reserve's, and this shows the total cash assets for small domestically chartered commercial banks, the small banks, right? And you can see what happened there after 2008. If you look back at that, that up and down gray bar, you see the big expansion after the financial crisis of 1998. Why was this going on? Because of the bailouts that were coming from the government and coming from the taxpayers, right? And then look what happened in 2020. Just a massive explosion. Of course, this was the worldwide flu that went on. They were sending out all sorts of stimulus checks to people, and people put it in the bank. And a massive move up. Now, since then, see a massive decline down. So from a percentage basis, the small banks have 6% worth of their assets in cash. These are the large banks. The last chart was for the small banks. This is for the large banks. And you can see that the pattern is identical to the charts for the small banks. However, if you look at the far right of the chart, the current ratio of cash to assets is 13%. So remember, for the small banks, it was 6%. And for the large banks, it's 13%, which means the larger banks have a lot more money. So that's how they can afford to acquire all of these smaller banks. So this ongoing process of gobbling up the small banks as they fail can continue because these banks have so much cash that they can use to do it with. Now, let's remember why these small banks are failing. The primary problem is the dramatic rise in interest rates. So why does rising interest rates make banks go out of business? Well, because these banks, they put assets on their books, primarily like U.S. Treasuries, right? And bonds have an inverse relationship with interest rates. So as interest rates go up, the value of their bonds on their books go down and destroys their balance sheets. So as these small banks go out of business one by one, and they are the most vulnerable, right? They're going to go out of business before the big banks do. And as they go out of business, they're going to be acquired by the larger banks. And let's take a look at a chart to help you conceptualize this process. But as these banks start to consolidate, they end up in the larger banks, namely banks like Citicorp, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, etc. So the net result is you have fewer banks. So it'll be much easier for the central bank to control, a handful of banks instead of, thousands of banks. And I believe that is the real end game here. This is all moved toward centralizing the financial industry. That's eventually going to lead us to CBDCs and full control of our personal sovereignty. This is what it's all leading to. And I think this is not just going to be a US-based issue. This is a global issue. You're going to see all countries around the world going through the same process. In the end, there are people out there who want a one world government, okay? And this is part of that process. All right, so a lot of you might think that I'm a conspiracy nut, but I think I just made my case, and I will leave it to you to draw your own conclusion.
Copy that.